So we're excited to start the third Aesthetics for Distant Birds workshop. And our first presenter will be Justine Kingsbury from the University of, what is it? Waikato, right? And Justine, are you there? I don't see you right in front of me.
I am here.
There you are. And if you want to take it away and share your screen, we will start. So welcome, thanks.
I'm trying to screen share. Is it working?
Yeah, not yet. Sorry to
yet.
I just sort of sprang it on you that we were starting.
That's all right. Slideshow. All right, share.
Perfect.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes, cool. Right. Just as a side note, I don't think I can see the chat box while I'm doing this, so you might have to actually shout at me at the 10-minute point, but we'll see. So self-report, an unstable foundation for aesthetic theorising. Many areas of aesthetics involve theorising about people's responses to or experiences of things such as artworks or nature. There are some examples of areas in aesthetics in which this is so. My question is, well, how do we find out about those responses and experiences? And in the normal course of things, it seems to be supposed in aesthetics that we find out about them by introspection in our own case, or from people's reports on their own experiences, or from generalizing about our own case and finding out about other people's responses and experiences. I'm going to give one example from the literature on music, in aesthetics, on musical expressiveness of a way in which people use self-report, and raise some worries about introspection and self-report. And then briefly, because I mean, a sensible response to this is, well, but how else can we possibly find out about people's experiences of aesthetic objects? Suggest some alternatives. So the question of musical expressiveness is, what do we mean, roughly? What do we mean when we describe a piece of music as sad? And there are two general categories of answer. If you think the answer is roughly, we mean that it makes us sad, then you're an arousal theorist or a motivist. If you think the answer is something like, we mean that there's some property of the music itself that we call sadness and that we're perceiving in some way that needn't involve feeling that emotion ourselves, then you're a cognitivist. Here are a couple of versions of cognitivism about musical expressiveness as Derek Matravers presents them. Stephen Davies and Gerald Levinson, in both cases, Matravers has them saying something about people's experiences, hearing music as expressive as a matter of experiencing the resemblance between it and human behaviour. Or Levinson, music expressive of E as music heard as someone expressing E, or heard as if someone is using it to express E. And then Matravers goes on to ask which of these is correct. They presumably whichever one is the right account, the right description of the experience of expressive music is going to command the assent of qualified listeners. It's describing experience with which surely we're all familiar, or most of us are familiar. However, he says qualified listeners don't agree. And then again, he says about Levinson, well, and about Davies, these descriptions suggest a way the experience is, and so there's a problem for the theory if the suggestion doesn't capture people's experience. I don't think that that Matravers is unusual in using comparing a theory to people's experience and supposing that how we get at people's experiences is by asking them, what do you feel, or how do you respond? So I'm not getting at Derek Matravers here. I think this is just a clear illustration of a thing that's done all the time in aesthetics. So, can we be wrong about our own experiences? The traditional view is no, so at least just with some kinds of experiences. I can't be wrong about there seeming to be a red thing in front of me, even if I obviously can be wrong about whether there really is a red thing in front of me. I'm authoritative about my own experiences. And likewise, hard to see how I can be wrong about whether or not I'm in pain. But note that I might miscommunicate with you about my experience. So maybe I categorize a feeling as pain that you would categorize as mere discomfort. So there's, even if I can't be wrong about being in pain, as I construe pain, there can still be an issue about my report of being in pain. Emotions, well, clearly I can be wrong about what causes my sadness and about the object of my sadness. Can I be wrong about being sad? Well, I think just surely yes. We've got perfectly everyday examples where you're angry, but you don't know that you are, but other people know that you are. They can tell from your behaviour. And a case from an aesthetics class that I teach regularly. So I quite often ask in the very first class, I play people a piece of sad music, play the students sad music, and ask them to write down what they feel. And we haven't done any theorising at this point. This is supposed to be their pre-theoretic response to the music. Then a few weeks later, once we've heard about different theories of musical expressiveness and how you might or might not mean that you're made sad by music when you describe that music as sad. So 3 or 4 weeks later, play them the same piece of music, very different responses. So in the first case, lots of them say that they feel sad. 4 weeks later, far fewer of them say that they feel sad when they listen to this music. And I take it that it's not that the experience has changed, but that they now kind of have some tools for thinking about what they're experiencing, and are less inclined to go straight from sad to kind of that something sad is going on here, to it must be me that's feeling sad because there's no one else around that the sadness could be attributed to. So this seems like a case where theory infects your report of your own emotional responses. So problems with self-report, we might not be able to put our emotional and other responses into words, or other people may not interpret and may use the same words differently, but also that we may not be able to reliably identify our own emotional and other responses, a problem with introspection. So the upshot, first of all, developing a theory in aesthetics on the basis of your own introspective responses might be something to be careful about. You might hope people don't do this too much anyway. I think they do, but that's a side issue. Testing a theory in aesthetics by seeing what it predicts about how people will respond, and then checking whether they do or whether they say that they do respond in that way. That I think is quite common in aesthetics, and there are lots of debates between people about whether people actually do have the responses that the theory predicts that they're going to have, and that too looks like something to be careful of. A quick possible objection, perhaps, so I'm saying that relying on self-report is fairly ubiquitous in aesthetics, but perhaps not, perhaps it doesn't play that big a role. So in some cases, aesthetic theories are prescriptive rather than descriptive, and you might think, well, no claims are being made about people's actual responses, only about how people should respond. And so then the issue of whether people are actually responding in that way and how we can tell doesn't seem like such an issue. Or another way of putting this, could be another way of putting this, could be a different point. Sometimes what we're doing is conceptual analysis. For example, if we're talking about aesthetic responses to nature, we're thinking about kind of what is it to have, well, theories of this often talking about what it is to have an aesthetic experience and whether and how people have these in response to natural objects. If that's what you're doing, you might think, well, this doesn't require us to put much weight on people's reported experiences at all. And another thing, some of the theories in question might be being mischaracterized as having phenomenological implications when they don't really. So I think actually Matravers mischaracterizes Stephen Daly's view, that his view isn't that we actually experience music as resembling expressive behavior. Rather, we hear music as sad or happy or whatever. And what accounts for that is that it resembles expressive behavior, but there's not a claim that we experience it as resembling expressive behaviour. So then, suppose that I think one upshot is we should be careful about what our claims are and what kind of evidence tells for and against them, and what kind of project are we engaged in. But then also that we should be a bit cautious about relying on self-report. But then kind of what else is there? How else do we find out about people's experiences? You might think experimental philosophy or psychological research is the answer, but to the extent that this is done by surveys, doesn't help. It's still self-report. You might think that looking at people's non-verbal behaviour is a better way to go, and I endorse this so long as the data is carefully interpreted, and also kind of physiological research and neurophysiological research into what's going on with people's physiological research and what's going on with people's heart rates and so on when they're listening to a particular piece of music, or brain scans or whatever. I think there are always issues about how to interpret this kind of data, and we have to be careful there too. But in principle, it seems like these seem like workable ways to go. Just to conclude, so I'm endorsing being careful about your sources of evidence for claims about people's responses, both in the case of self-report and in the case of these other kind of suggested alternatives. I have heard people have objected to this, that if we shift from self-report to these other kinds of kind of more third personal sources of evidence, it's no longer clear that we're talking about the responses that made us interested in the problem in the first place. I don't share that worry, because I suppose that what we're reporting on is a physiological and neurological and so on state. So I'm not much moved by this. I am new to this area, so I think quite likely many of you know of stuff that I should be reading that I haven't read yet. So here is my email address if you'd like to email me details. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Normally we would applaud here, but it sounds funny on this thing, so yeah. You'll see everybody doing it. So I will, nice. I will turn it over to Aaron, who will now start asking questions. So,
do you guys, you have me live?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. So quick question from Jonathan. Why do you think in the case that you described in your class, Justine, why do you think the experience has not changed on the second report in the music case? Do you think it would change if they had musical rather than philosophical training?
I'm not sure. So if it's just their emotional response to the music that we're talking about, I think I might be inclined to think that it won't change, both with either with musical training or with philosophical training, that there's a kind of base response that you have. But I'm not wedded to this. Do you want to follow up, Jonathan?
Well, Jenny asked a kind of related question. Does knowledge or theory only impact upon reporting of experience? Might it also impact upon what notices, values, find significant, and so how one mentally represents their experience, and so the experience itself? So I think she's pushing the same
line,
direction.
Yes. Yes. I think it might, yeah, I think you're actually, I backtracked from what I said to Jonathan. Surely it could change your actual experience, as you say, what you notice. I think in many of the cases that people are talking about, so I didn't I've talked about the musical expressiveness case, and I do think this is the case of this, but also the case I didn't have time to talk about, aesthetic responses to nature. I think a lot of the theorising about this presupposes that these are very much brute responses that are not theory infected, and so I guess that's another thing to worry about. Whereas, I mean, you might well think it is, I suppose, your Cynthia and Jonathan may both be suggesting that actually all of our experiences are theory infected. Thanks. I need to think about that more.
That was Jenny and Jonathan, just as keep track. Cynthia asked a related thing. Yep. Can our experience of the related. Can our experience of the emotional quality of music be affected by the setting in an audience versus alone at home or our earphones?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely. Yes.
Okay. And following up on the music, on the emotion case, Helen asks, is introspection about emotion especially unreliable? Are other kinds of introspection about other features of aesthetic experience, for example, more likely to be reliable? So is the emotion case a specifically unreliable or problematic case?
That's a good question. I'd be interested to hear what the rest of you think. So if you think about the case I haven't talked about, the aesthetic responses to nature case, I suppose that there's a debate between Carlson and Carroll about how aesthetic responses to nature work, they do kind of go head to head about who has these responses and what do they look like. It seems to me that if you step back from that debate, what's going on is that it's really about what is it to call an experience aesthetic, and then you would never have thought that people had first person authority about that so they can, you might have thought they can report on how they feel and what it's like to be moved by a beautiful waterfall or whatever. Those things are the things we might have thought they were authoritative about, but not the more theoretical thing. Then I'm not sure what I think about your question. I suppose that actually we are better at that kind of thing. So I know which natural objects move me. I can, if I think about it, report on what that moving is like. Perhaps I'm better at it, and I'm better at that than people mostly are about reporting their emotional responses to music, for example. But I'm not sure. I'd like to hear what the rest of you think, but I realise this isn't a format in which we can get back and forth going.
Our idea for back and forth is that people could email you afterwards.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
We really want to encourage that. So if you have further follow-up, please contact the speakers. Here's an
and also sorry, Aaron, and you can type answers to the questions in the comments as well if you're worried that we'll get them later, and then we'll send the transcript out.
Yeah, Justine will get the speakers will get the transcript. So this is an interpretive question from Robbie Kubala. Do you think some of the Matraver style claims are plausibly reinterpreted as prescriptive or normative? For example, that competent listeners ought to experience music as having resemblance to human emotion?
I think arousal theorists such as Matravers himself are often doing quite a prescriptive thing. You're not listening to the sad music properly if you're not being saddened by it. I am less inclined to think that the cognitivists that Matravers is interpreting have that view. They seem more to be trying to report on I think actually they're mostly less interested in what people's experiences in fact are like. They tell you kind of what emotions people have, what emotions there are in the music, and theorize about kind of what it is about the music that causes people to say that emotion is in the music. But they are mostly, except for Peter Kivy, less interested in prescribing how people ought to be listening to music.
From Chris Bartel, a question ripe for experimentation. Maybe. I wonder if the reliability of self-reports are affected by whether the report is a positive or negative claim. In the positive claim case, if I say, I feel moved by X, it seems obnoxious for someone to say, no, you're not. But in the negative claim case, if I say, I'm not particularly moved by X, it might make sense to say, oh, yes, you are. You should test that, Chris. Sorry.
Right. That's like the anger case I was talking about. That so I think that I'm not angry, but people can say yes you are, and they can be right about that. But if I say that I'm angry, it's rude. Well, I mean, you say it's obnoxious, and I think you're right. It is obnoxious for people to deny that I'm feeling what I think I'm feeling. But I think maybe that's more a matter of etiquette than anything to do with the one being more authoritative than the other.
Okay. From Renee Jagnow, he worries that your approach is somewhat naturalizing of music. Emotions in music are tropes that are historically constructed. So I would imagine responding to them is a cognitive process.
Yeah. So me or the people I'm talking about. So I think that the theorists that Travers talks about, Davies and Levinson, they aren't thinking about kind of the history of musical expressiveness and conventions and so on, but other theorists do. So I think maybe this is just an accident of the particular example chosen.
That's what we have right now for questions. Jonathan, how are we doing time-wise?
We've got about 40 seconds left. If anyone has a quick one.
Wait, Weinberg has one. Can he get it out? Can he get it out, Weinberg? Come on, Weinberg. Come on. Come on. Is straight up unreliability the right way to think about it?
Maybe, right.
Or can we sometimes detect patterns of errors?
Yeah. Surely we can detect patterns of errors. It will be interesting as I kind of work this out some more to see whether they're playing a role here. I was thinking of it as simply there is this kind of assumption of first person authority, I think, across a lot of aesthetics, and so then I'm querying that. But surely there are much more nuanced things to be done. Yeah, thank you.
Great. All right. So thanks to everyone who questioned, and thanks so much for the presentation, Justine.
Thank you.
So I will empower. Oh, I should have been doing this before, and now I am slow. So our next speaker is Helen Daly from Colorado College, whom I will allow to share her screen. There, I've bestowed on you the power. And so the title is Insulting Architecture. So this is show and tell. So Helen, take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, so when I say show and tell, I mean this is really early in this project. I don't know what I'm doing, so I'm looking for feedback. So I'm going to say a little about insults, a little about architecture, and then I want to say that architecture, I think, has a special capacity to stand as a sort of ongoing, intrusive insult in our lives. So I think it's really interesting in that way. That's what I'm going to argue for anyway. Oh shoot, hang on. Yes, I figured out how to advance a slide. So here's my take on insults. I wrote a paper on, I do philosophy of language. I don't do aesthetics, so I don't know what I'm doing. But okay, so I wrote a paper on insults where I argued that insults are expressions of a lack of due regard. And this is a little bit contrary to like the more standard view, which characterizes insults by intent. So you might say, you know, to insult someone, it's to intend to insult them, to mean to hurt them. I think that's just wrong. I think we usually insult people, like more frequently anyway, accidentally. And it can be, I think, by act or by omission. So that's why I put that missed high five in there, because I think that GIF is nice. You know, I mean, sometimes you just don't see it. So maybe you just missed it accidentally. So I think insults need to be characterized by what they express, and in particular, their expression of a lack of due regard. That means anything expressive can express an insult. That's going to include words, gestures, laws, norms, and any kind of expressive artwork. So why focus on architecture? And here's why I think it's important. It shapes the spaces that we live in, so it really affects us profoundly. It's also longer lasting, like, you know, a slanderous word is gone in a minute, but a public building you might have to live with for decades. And I also think that it can be an insult in several interesting ways. So the picture there is Antilia. It's a private home in Mumbai. I think it's kind of disgustingly a case of conspicuous consumption. Also, it's kind of just gross looking, but further, a 100-year-old orphanage was torn down to make space for it. So there are many reasons why you might take it to be, like every time you walk by, you just feel kind of irritated. Okay, so what counts as architecture is a question I'm not going to answer. So I'm gonna just put that aside because I think it's about boundaries, and I wanna focus on the paradigmatic sort of cases, and what I'm gonna take to be paradigmatic is buildings that were designed with some aesthetic vision and goals. And then later, I think, getting into boundary cases is cool. All right, next. Right, Marcus Vitruvius Polio. So what I wanted to say about this, a building I think can be an insult with respect to each of these different features that he describes. So he evaluates or suggests that we should evaluate architecture on the basis of these three qualities. And I think it's kind of been taken up. A lot of people think that's probably kind of roughly right. So it should be structurally sound, it should be functional for its purpose, and it should be beautiful. And I think you can fail in each of those ways in some way that actually offends people, that is like insulting to them. So I'm just going to go through some examples, and again, show and tell, right? So here we go, examples. Firmitas, soundness. The picture there is Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright. He was an engineer, so he knew better, right? But he built this super expensive house that he knew was not going to last. It's beautiful, but he didn't care that these people invested tons of money into his vanity project, which started immediately falling down. It was their house. I think it's just blithely unstable. And so I would take that to be an insult to the owners, a sort of lack of due regard for their interests. And the house itself expresses that lack of due regard. I think it is like a lasting, fixed expression of a lack of due regard for those owners. This one is not just an insult. This is, the Grenfell Tower fire was first a crime because it was a violation of building code to put that flammable facing on the outside of the building. It was second a tragedy because like 70 people died and 70 more were injured. And then in addition, there's an insult added to the injury. The insult is that the architects just didn't care. They wanted the building to look nice enough that the neighbors wouldn't complain. And so they put this flammable facing on it, knowing that it might kill people. And I think that's clearly disregard for their well-being. So a lack of due regard for the residents. Okay. I hope I'm not going too fast. Okay, I only have 10 minutes. I can go too fast. All right, so next, utilitas, that's functionality. This is a picture of the Hunters Point Community Library in Queens, New York. It was just completed last fall. And as you can see, it's like beautiful. It's got these big light-filled spaces, but the best seats and many of the shelves, books are only accessible by stairs. So I don't know, I think people in Queens use wheelchairs sometimes. I think they sometimes have strollers with them. It's technically legal, it's compliant with laws for the disabled, only because there are staff around who can fetch the books for you. But you don't get to enjoy the library. Like, all of the good seating is not available to you. And so I think that's insulting to the disabled. Next, oh, this is another library. This one's the library at Cornell University, also completed just last fall. And it has open mesh floors. So the picture here is a picture of Nicole Nomura. She's an architecture grad student at Cornell who is quoted saying, "This building was obviously designed by a man." I mean, lots of people wear skirts. Many of them use the library. So it was just not designed with those people in mind. And again, like every time you walk into this building, the space would feel unwelcoming to you. And yeah, I think that it demonstrates a lack of due regard for the people who might use it. A third example, bathrooms, lacking gender neutral bathrooms, or like the campus, one of the campus science buildings at my college has like one women's bathroom in the basement and it's hard to find. It just, it says a lot about who you prioritize when you don't have bathrooms for all of the people who will be using the building. And then beauty. This hallway is actually much prettier than the ones in my public schools when I was growing up. They were just so hideous. So, I mean, here we go. There's no natural light. It's, I don't know, there's poor ventilation, presumably. The hallways are designed to be noisy and crowded. I think this is just typical of American public schools. And what it shows is a disregard for the well-being of those kids. They're forced to be surrounded by ugliness most of their waking life, right? That's terrible. This is my last example, more beauty. So this is Cosset Hall, also on my college campus. The windows that we're looking at there all look to the west where the mountains are. And the view from those windows was undoubtedly gorgeous. And now, I'm not sure when it was built, sometime mid-20th century, there's actually a hockey arena about 15 feet west of this building. So all of those windows, lovingly designed to look out to the west, are, they look at a bare solid brick wall. It's, I think, deeply offensive. I think that choice to it's the classics building. So, you know, who cares about the classics? But that, you know, you just can't help but feel like, don't you care at all? Like, how could you design this space for me to live in that it takes my needs into regard so slimly? So here we go, I'm already done. So in sum, I think an insult is an expression of a lack of due regard. I argued for that elsewhere, so I just didn't say anything. And then architects build spaces for people. I think they should consider the needs of those people, particularly with respect to those three different classes. So the three different kinds of relevant needs here. There are more, but these are the three basic ones I was looking at: soundness, functionality, and beauty. And then in the, okay, so like I said, I'm just getting started. These are the other things that I think are really cool. So monuments being torn down right now, those are more direct expressions than buildings are. And so they can convey a lack of due regard more directly. So like a standard statue of a person implies that the person should be venerated by future generations. And so I think implying anything like that about someone who is historically controversial, that's the kind of thing that would be naturally taken to be an insult. But it's more like a verbal expression than a building is. And then urban planning. So questions like whose streets, right? There's some cool work on GIS and urban planning that Quill Kukla has done. And I think their take on whose interests are considered and why is really interesting here and could relate to something like insult. Like if you consider, oh gosh, like what kind of bike lanes, or if there are bike lanes in your city, it suggests something about who you're prioritizing. When you are concerned about commuting times, but you're only taking into consideration the people who work regular 9-to-5 jobs, it's a way of prioritizing the middle class. So I think that kind of work is probably related to this. There's a lot of other stuff I probably should have cited, but didn't. But 10 minutes, right? That's my excuse. So, all right. Let me should I unshare this for questions?
Great, awesome, thanks.
Okay.
So again, clap, wave. And I will turn it over to Aaron. Aaron, are you live? And
Am I live? Let me,
awesome.
hold on.
So take it away.
All right, lots of great questions from people. We're going to try to hit these quickly, Helen. So from Alex, is the architecture insulting by virtue of the architect's insult? In other words, is the disregard expressive of the architect's disregard for the user dwellers, or does the architecture itself somehow express disregard?
Yeah, I think that the architecture is very much like a standing insult, in the same way that, like, if I were to type up some screed about how much I hate you and how terrible you are, the insult would be in the screed itself, but I would be the one doing the insulting. And I don't think architects generally are capable, well, sometimes. I mean, there are so many people involved in a big project that it's hard to say that it's this one person's fault. Like, you know, it was the board of trustees on my campus who decided to put that hockey arena right in the middle of the classics department's gorgeous mountain view. So, you know, I would say it's not just the architect, but that it is people. People are doing the insulting, I think, and that the object is the standing, ongoing insult.
Okay, Robbie asks, can something be an insult if it isn't taken by its target as an insult? In particular, suppose the buyers of Falling Water knew it wasn't built to last They bought it qua artwork, not qua functional home. And so they did not take falling water as expressing a lack of due regard for them.
Yeah, so I do think it's possible to be insulted without realizing it, but I would not take that case to be an example. So my sort of my standard kind of case is not an architecture one, but a typical insult. But I would say, you know, like if I am imbued in a kind of sexist culture, and so I don't recognize that someone is being sexist toward me, I may not get that I've been insulted, even though I have been, right? And that would be my mistake. I really have been insulted because people have been acting toward me with a lack of due regard, but I didn't catch it. Falling water, though, if they're really happy with it and if they were getting it for the purpose of its being an artwork, then I would say their functional needs were taken into consideration appropriately. Now, my understanding is that one of the buyers, in fact, was too tall for many of the ceilings. The ceilings were built for someone of Frank Lloyd Wright's height, not for the buyer, who is significantly taller than he was. That's kind of a jerk move. I would, but if they were totally happy, if they were like, no, functionality be damned, this is doing exactly what we want it to do, then there's no insult there, no.
Okay, two questions, one from Keito and one from Ankuta about the expression of lack of due regard condition on insult. So Keito asks, is there any difference between a building made to express a lack of due regard and a building made just with a lack of due regard? So does the expression play a particular role? And Ankuta asks, can you reframe this by saying that any lack of functional beauty regarding architecture is an insult?
Well, okay. I like both of those parts. No, I wouldn't say that like anything that lacks beauty is an insult. But it also, so intention is weird, right? Like I want to say that the building sort of expresses the lack of due regard, even though maybe it is not like, you know, the architect intends for it to thereby express something that I verbally, you know, as architect want to say. Rather, it's more like it demonstrates it, it wears it right there on its sleeve, you know, you walk by and you're offended. So intention is weird here because sometimes it makes an insult worse and sometimes it makes it better. You know, sometimes you want to say like the unintentional insult is the most painful kind. You know, when someone doesn't mean to hurt you, but they just didn't think about you at all. You know, like, oh, there are people who use wheelchairs? Weird, you know, like I never would have thought of that. Or, oh, there aren't really any non-binary people. We don't need gender neutral bathrooms, you know, right? It's like they just don't even think you exist or something. So it's almost more offensive than the intentional insult. So so intention is weird. I'm not quite sure about that. But yeah, I wouldn't want to say that like every ugly building is an insult, though having lived in a lot of ugly spaces, I can say like, really, they do bring you down and you kind of wish someone had thought for, like, you know, before you built it, think about how this will hurt people who have to live in that space. Like, will it ruin their lives? Will it make their day just terrible every day?
So we got two really closely related questions. One from Tamara Levitz, which is why do you want to group all these cases under insults? The question of accessibility doesn't seem to be an insult. And Elizabeth Scarborough asked something similar. What's the benefit of using the language of insult rather than offensive, immoral, etc.? So why insult for all these cases?
Yeah, so I think in the case of accessibility in particular, I think it's sort of like the Grenfell Towers case. There's a lot going on. The insult isn't the only part. There's an injury and an insult, and I don't want to overemphasize the importance of the insult, but I don't want to leave it out either. So I think, you know, ADA violations are, they limit accessibility for a group of people, and they thereby do them a wrong. But at the same time, they also reflect a sort of lack of concern with their well-being and with their interests, and that is an insult in addition. So I think the insult just makes it worse. It makes it more painful. Why the language of insults? I'm actually not that, I don't think it's that important. Yeah, I mean, I think it's one way of talking about it. Talking about offensiveness might lead us into something a little fuzzier about offense. Like I'm trying to use insult as a kind of a purely like truth tracking kind of term. So I want it to be like, no, this really is an insult. And offense, I feel like, is so obviously subjective that I'm reluctant to go that way. But clearly, like, there's lots of moral language in the neighborhood that I think would be appropriate.
So Angela's son asked, do you think it can be insulting for an architect to pander to their audience? Might this be a way in which architects fail to express a lack of due regard for the intellect or taste of the audience?
Yeah, that's a pretty sophisticated insult, but yeah, totally. Yeah, you could do that. That's a great case, actually. I really like that. Thank you.
Okay, and Saul raised a question about the lack of due regard in the architectural case. He thinks it might be tricky because of multiple users and receivers of the work. Standard issue in design, never knowing who beyond the immediate prospectus or what developers promise, who exactly will use the building or how. So that's an issue for functionality, but maybe for other issues as well. So I guess there's a question of who the others are in the lack of due regard for the others and the fact that the architectural case might have a lot of others.
Yeah, it really might. And that, again, that's part of the reason why I think it's so deeply troubling. So I guess I think if you're looking at an ancient Roman temple and it distresses you that it was not designed with wheelchair users in mind, you've made a mistake because there were none when it was built. There probably were people with limited mobility at the time, but there was nobody specifically using a wheelchair in ancient Rome. So the architect who designs the building that doesn't have ramps in ancient Rome, like, they didn't wrong you. That's not an insult. It might be an injury to you not to be able to get in there, but it's not insulting. Because they could not reasonably foresee that some members of their public would have this particular need. So they weren't overlooking it or overlooking those people. But yeah, but I mean, like, if you design a courthouse or something, yeah, you have no idea who all might use it in the future. And any of them are potential insultees that you could overlook. So, you know, think about it, like, really try to, you know, be thoughtful about who's being left out.
Okay, some related questions about insulting. So Franklin points out that arguably some verbal or other behavioral insults are justified because the person insulted have shown themselves unworthy of regard. We're showing both them and other observers that we think so. Could an architectural insult ever be justified? And relatedly, Melissa asks, is there a case where buildings being insulting makes it better art? So justified, architectural insults justified, architectural insults better as art?
You know, I like that. I don't know if I can think of an example. It seems like it ought to be possible anyway, but it would have to be, it would have to be pretty sophisticated probably, because somehow, like, if we want the insultingness itself to be part of what makes the building better, then the insult would have to be clever. It would have to be really cleverly done. And it's easy to do that, I think, in some kinds of art, and probably kind of hard to do with a building because, again, your audience is so big. And so who's going to get your joke, or who's going to see the clever trick that you're pulling? Now, if you just want to say, like, well, look, this building was built a long time ago. We're doing renovations. ADA regulations require us to put in wheelchair ramps, and we don't want to because it's going to spoil the look of the front of the building. You know, it's more beautiful without it, even though it's more insulting. That's a kind of easy case, I guess, but I think it's less interesting than something where someone's actually designing it to be insulting and the insult is the point. I really like that. Yeah.
Right. I think that has to be the last question, if that's right. So great. Thanks so much, Helen. That was great.
That was really fun.
Thanks for all the questions. So our next speaker is Keito Iwakiri, and his talk is going to be, sorry, I'm also making him a co-host here, but failing, is going to be, I'm sorry, Normative Theories of Art and the Diversity of Art, and he is magically empowered. Awesome. So, Keito, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. And let me first thank all the organizers for letting this happen. And and before moving on, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Keito Iwakiri from Tokyo, Japan, and I'm just got my MS degree this April, and I'm preparing for future PhD applications. And I just started working on this project, so any comments are welcome. So, yep. And and my presentation title is Normative Theories of Art and Non-Western Art. And this presentation was supposed to have 2 parts, but it turned out that 10 minutes is too short for that. So I'm sorry, but let me start with the conclusion of the first part. In a nutshell, some philosophers have proposed that a normative theory of art is more fruitful than a descriptive one, given taking the so-called charge from psychology seriously, and a normative theory of art specifies what sort of concept we should use or what concept pays off the best. With that in mind, my starting point is the assumption that art exists all around the world. Behind the word non-Western art seems lacking this assumption. Some art, like non-Western art, is said to be neglected or marginalized in history or art history. So if that assumption is correct, it seems better if we can theorize art in that broader sense. But is it really? So that's my question. So the problem is that there is no concept covering all art, alleged art. And all concepts of art can be thought to be flawed extensionally in that point, if these assumptions are right. The question I'm gonna tackle is, are normative theories more variable or helpful in this respect? Let me first clarify what I mean by the word normative. I think a theory can be normative in at least 2 ways. First, by being metaphysically revisionary, which means revealing something independent of us, or independent of a belief or practice. And the second, by being pragmatically ameliorative, which means changing our use of some concept to serve some purpose. Let me call the former revisionary theory and the latter ameliorative theory for simplicity. And some philosophers are explicitly concerned not with the concept of art, but art itself. Dominic Lopez, Stephen Davis, Nick Sengue are example, but these are out of the scope of this presentation because they are not theorizing about the concept. But that doesn't mean I'm against this kind of approach, yeah. So let's get focused on ameliorative theories. There are two types of ameliorative theories. First, we can choose what concept we should use among many different concepts of art. This is suggested by Aaron. And the second one is, we can revise our existing concept to serve some purpose. This one is favored by Anelius Monzere. I hope my pronunciation is right. And let me take one by one. So the first one is, why choose that concept? Miskin clearly leaves room for ameliorative theories, although he doesn't specify what concept of art we should use. So here's a quote saying, the question becomes not whether we can define art, but first of all, what sort of concept of art will be most useful or variable? The question of use or value here cannot be divorced from the purpose for which we are to use the concept. And then, is the purpose to address all art compatible with this kind of approach? I don't think so. First of all, as I said, we don't have any concept covering all art. Choosing any concept means leaving some art out from the domain of art. And a lot of failed attempts to get the right extension in the definition industry might facilitate this claim. So, and second, imported concepts, chosen concept might conflict with existing concept that share some of the extension with them. And the last, choosing among the Western concepts of art without any reason is problematic. So let me illustrate that idea. Japan is a good case showing how problematic choosing a concept is, on some purpose. In the Meiji era, the term bijutsu was coined by the government to refer to Western fine arts, but only things considered to be valued in the West were included in the bijutsu. The term excluded like Chinese southern paintings, calligraphies, and ukiyo-es, all of which are important variable art activities in Japan. And the southern paintings came from Chinese tradition, so it didn't fit in the Western concept of art. So it was excluded. And ukiyo-es were exported and sold given the popularity of Japanism in the West. So these are considered to contradict the Western concept, which highly valued the autonomy of art. So the case, the Japan case is a good example of choosing what concept we should use. I mean, maybe bad example, because choosing the Western art left traditional kinds of art in Japan out. And the Western art actually conflicted with some conception that shared some of the extension. And choosing the Western art was politically, aesthetically problematic since our original concepts and cultures got subordinated. And more or less the same thing could be said if the West chose some stranger concept like geijutsu or bijutsu to use thereafter. So yeah, and the second approach is by Monzere, and according to her, art is a framework concept. A framework concept is a concept that has a structuring role in the field in which it's functioning. In other words, it's hard to imagine how the field under consideration could operate without that concept. And here's another quote. Given that the grouping of the arts is to some extent arbitrary and biased, it is important to revise and ameliorate this concept, which means the Western art concept, rather than ignore it altogether. However, if the Western art concept is a framework concept, I suppose there are prime facie reasons to believe that other concepts like geijutsu in Japan or awaran in Yoruba are framework concepts in their context as well. And plus, on one hand, why the Western art should be chosen as a starting point when we want some broader concept? Because it's the most superior or the most prevailing? I think this can't be the reason. On the other, any concept extended to include more or less would be distorted, and may be distorted enough to lose consistency in its intention. And here's another Japanese example. There is another Japanese word now with about the same extension as the Western art. Before the Meiji era, the word geijutsu referred to not only fine arts, but also martial arts, arithmetic, and the others. However, this word came to include dance, sculpture, and others as Western art did, and exclude martial arts and arithmetic as the Western art did. This was because geijutsu came to be used as the translation of the Western art. And due to the fact geijutsu and the related concepts like wabi, sabi, yugen, or mono no aware came to fall apart. And now there is no word or concept uniting Japanese traditional arts such as no, chado, and others, which were classified under the geijutsu in the Meiji era, I mean before the Meiji era. And another problem with the revisionist approach is that it's difficult to implement the semantic change. And yeah, I'm based on what Max Deutsch claims, and he says speaker's meaning and semantic meaning are distinct, and the speaker's relation to mean something by the word art is not enough to change the semantic meaning of the word art. And the Japan cases suggest that it took so much time and effort to introduce another concept or to revise some existing concept because it was governed by the Japanese government. And without help from the government, institutions and exhibitions, there had been no success in introducing or revising concepts. So in a nutshell, we have many concepts of art, so we can choose any. Choosing any is sacrificing others. And second, we can revise our concept. We can, but stipulation seems not enough. Also, revising existing concepts seems likely to distort our original concept. And although there could be alternative ways to change our use of concept, at least we should be very careful when we try to do so. And here are concluding remarks. And yeah, of course, an ameliorative theory might do a good job at revising some concept within that concept, say to include art by women, to include neglected art by women in the domain of the Western art. But in case of non-Western art, that kind of approach seems hopeless, yeah. And if ameliorative theories are not so fruitful, revisionary theories I mentioned first might be better at addressing the diverse nature of art. And paying attention to non-Western cultures is great and needed, but at least we should consider what consequences would follow by uniting or dividing art. Is that non-Western art or non-art, but variable cultural activity? And I'm personally inclined to relativism or eliminativism of art. Yeah, thanks, that's all.
All right, great, thanks so much. So applause, wave. So great, we are all set. And Aaron, take it away.
Ready to go, ready to go. Okay, a couple of questions on some possibilities people want to know whether you're interested in. Helen asks, would you prefer a very contextual kind of concept that changes depending on the circumstance, or multiple overlapping concepts? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm inclined to like culturally contextual concepts of art, and yeah, that could be one way to be relativist. And I think who was that? Simon Faulkner's cultural definition of art pursues that kind of way, and yeah, I think that is one of the possible ways we can take to address non-Western art or neglected art.
Justine Kingsbury asks, can we be pluralists and not choose using different concepts, using different concepts for different purposes and being very clear about what purposes we were using them for?
Yeah, I think it's possible, and yeah, but yeah, I mean, and we can be pluralism about like concepts of art and concepts of, like, as I said, geijutsu, or concepts of bijutsu. So yeah, but yeah, I mean, we should be careful when we take pluralism seriously. I mean, if we got wrong about what concept to use, that could be a politically or aesthetically problematic way of doing. So yeah, yeah, I think it's possible. Yeah.
So Uku asks, could you expand on what you mean about relativism about art?
I mentioned Simon Faulkner's cultural definition of art, and it basically is a combination of art concept relative to its context and institutional theory of art. And so it's basically says that something is art if, something is art in a context C if that work satisfies some kinds of functions or some kinds of values, and that work is given a status of art appreciation candidate. So yeah, that could be a way to be relativist about art. So I mean, there is no how to say unified art concept. We have like many types of art, I mean, seemingly art concepts in each context. Yeah, that could be a good way to be a relativist, yeah.
So Tom Cochran asks, do you think that contemporary Western philosophy concepts of art actually exclude Japanese cultures of art when properly understood?
When properly understood, so I think properly understanding is the problem. I mean, it seems that we have two different conceptions of art, which came from the original meaning of geijutsu or bijutsu, and which is hugely influenced by the Chinese conception of art, and the other one is Western art concept. And so, yeah, here's the thing. I mean, we can decide which concepts are like proper concepts in art, I mean, in Japan. So yeah, and so do you think that the contemporary Western philosophy concepts about actually exclude Japanese cultures about? Of course, I'm not prepared to answer the question. I mean, it's a good question, and I have to think more about that. Yeah.
So Tamara Levitz and I have similar questions. Tamara asks whether there's some sort of contradiction. You're sort of assuming a general concept of art. And I guess this is related to my question, which was, I wasn't sure you had given us good reason to think that there isn't any concept of art that covers all art. After all, in the way you formulate it, you say that covers all art. It seems like you're using some kind of concept there that covers all art.
So, yeah. So, of course, I mentioned art and non-Western art, sorry, in my presentation. So that might seem implying that there is some art concept actually covering all art, but maybe there could be that kind of concept, but normative theorists tend to think that whether that kind of concept pays off or not. So that kind of art concept, I don't think that kind of art concept is like helpful or variable in thinking or theorizing about art. So, I mean, that has like certain solid extension, but I don't think there is any good, how to say, I don't think that has any good explanatory power. So yeah, that would be the problem. But I don't deny that there could be that kind of art concept.
Okay, so this is following up on your response. Cynthia asks, what do you see the main consequences of adopting a concept of art? Is it relevant to schools and instruction, museums, artistic practitioners, different cultures, attitudes, intercultural consequences? So what are the consequences?
Okay, so, and because the time is not enough, so I actually excluded that part from my presentation. And I was going to say that, yeah, there are huge consequences on Japanese art. And as I said, southern paintings and calligraphies and I mentioned what? These types of art were excluded from that domain of art. And actually, these kinds of activities are not like educated in art universities in Japan. All things taught at art universities are like Western paintings and design or sculpture. So, and before the Meiji era, there are so many schools of like Chinese paintings and Chinese brush paintings or like haiku or so, but recently there is nothing like that. So that could be the serious consequences of adopting a like strange or alien concept of art.
Alex asks, doesn't your account just favor a finer grained space and maybe be super inclusive about what art applies to, but then say there's applied art and fine art and kajutsu art and bijutsu and...
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, I think that's yeah, promising. And I actually favor that kind of, how to say, that kind of way of thinking, but on one hand, but on the other hand, I'm a little bit inclined to like Dominic Lopez's backpathing theories of art, and basically says, which basically says there is no unifying concept of art, I mean, which can serve some purpose, I mean, some explanatory purpose. So yeah, I'm still deciding between these, but yeah, I mean, the one side is what Alex said. I mean, fine-grained. There are many fine-grained concepts of art. Yeah.
Okay. Helen asked relatedly, do you think Western disagreement about the definition of art gives other concepts more space? Like, could various Japanese concepts get uptake as just one as useful ways of understanding art?
So yeah, of course, there is difference between Western how to say, development of art concept and non-Western development of art concepts. And the Western one is a lot more complicated than others, I guess. So, but the disagreement itself doesn't give other concepts more space, I guess. And my point is choosing any leads to some kind of possible, choosing any might result in like politically or aesthetically problematic consequences. So I'm not sure. I don't know. Yeah. Sorry.
It's okay.
All right.
All right,
Good.
great job.
Good. Thanks a lot. That was great. And thanks for all the questions again.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Let me just do one quick thing. So our final presenter for tonight is Szu-Yen Lin, and the title is Interpreting Titles. So are you're screen shared and you're all set. So take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for staying till the last session of last presentation. Okay, I have been working on the problem of interpretation for some years, and today I want to focus on a special topic in the intention debate. Okay. The intentionalist debate is about whether the author's intention is relevant to the interpretation of her work. One way to look at the debate is to distinguish two questions. The first concerns what constitutes word meaning, and the second concerns whether the aim of interpretation is to track down those constituents. Most positions on interpretation base their answers to the latter on how they answer the former. There are four major contenders in the intentionalist debate.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you meaning, do you want to have a presentation? Did you mean to have a PowerPoint up? Or no?
Oh yeah, PowerPoint here, yeah.
Oh, right. So would you, you need to share your screen. Sorry.
I didn't share my screen.
Nope.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry about that.
Oh, I forget.
There it is. Perfect.
Sorry, my mistake.
No worries.
So the first position is there are four major contenders in the intentionalist debate, okay, listed on the slide. So actual intentionalists hold that the author's intention plays a role in fixing word meaning, and anti-intentionalists think that conventions do the trick. Hypothetical intentionalists claim that word meaning is determined by the appropriate audience's best hypothesis about the author's intention. Value maximizer maintain that the interpretations that present the work in the best light are to be favored. Except for anti-intentionalism, all the other three positions are committed to the so-called ontological contextualism, which holds that the identity and contents of a work are partly determined by contextual factors holding at the time of the work's production. These factors include, but are not limited to, the social-cultural conditions to which the work makes references, the category of the work, the relevant art traditions, the author's oeuvre, and the title of the work. These contextual factors are usually said to be the identity conditions of a work. Here, the connection to interpretation is that the interpreter should correctly identify the work in virtue of those contextual factors before she sets to interpreting it. Otherwise, she ends up not interpreting the work as author. The contextual factor I want to focus in this paper, okay, in today's presentation, is the title of a work. Some philosophers have shown that titles constrain interpretations of works. For example, in his paper Titles, Gerald Levinson identifies 7 types of titles and demonstrates how they affect what a word means. But the question that puzzles me here is that how do we settle what a title means? Of course, lacking such an account does not affect the overall plausibility of contextualism. However, this question seems to be real to philosophers interested in the problem of interpretation. If the title of a work does constrain or guide our interpretation of a work, how can we proceed with interpretation without knowing what the title means? It seems to me that once we ask what the title means, we become immediately engaged again in the intentionalist debate. Below, I try to offer my thoughts on this matter. What is the most plausible approach to interpreting titles? As I suggested, philosophers have not said much about this, but some brief comments have been offered. Okay, so I start by elaborating these short comments from other philosophers. Okay. According to Levinson, the titles we are concerned with in interpretation are the so-called true titles, that is, those given by the artist when she created the work. Levinson adds a caveat. If the author says the title has no significance, we are not going to take this remark seriously because the title still has force due to artistic conventions. There are 2 different but related questions here. Levinson's first comment concerns how to establish the text for interpretation. Many philosophers have pointed out that before we set to interpreting a discourse, we must first establish the correct text, namely the true text. For example, titles must be corrected. More importantly, it is reasonable to keep authorial uses of language as they are, because corrections could change text identity. In the case of titles, it is very common that the publisher substitutes the title given by the author for a completely different one due to commercial considerations. It is also common for a publisher to make some small changes to the original title given by the author due to similar considerations. On Levinson's view, neither gives us the true title, hence not the appropriate guide to interpretation. Levinson's second comment sounds like an anti-intentionalist approach. The claim here is that after the text is established, conventions are our main guides to interpreting its title. It is important to know that there is no inconsistency in holding different positions on text establishment and text interpretation. One can be an intentionalist about the former, but an anti-intentionalist about the latter. Another philosopher whose comment has touched the present issue is Stephen Davis. Like Levinson, Davis agrees that titles are among the relevant contextual factors that fix word identity. In particular, he speaks of the artist's titling intention when considering how titles constrain interpretation. Here, Davis seems to adopt actual intentionalism with respect to interpreting titles. That is, for him, the meaning of a title is determined by what the author intended it to mean. There are different versions of actual intentionalism. The extreme version is out of the question because it has the consequence of allowing the author to mean whatever she intends the title to mean. The modest version is more plausible. It holds that meaning is determined by the author's intention when such intention delivers. Otherwise, meaning is determined by conventions. It seems reasonable to take the titling intention to be fallible, hence allowing for cases in which the meaning of a title is determined by conventions when authorial intent goes awry. Aside from anti-intentionalism and actual intentionalism, there are hypothetical intentionalism and the value maximizing theory. I argue that although anti-intentionalism and modest intentionalism about titles are not without their own problems, they are better positions on interpreting titles compared to hypothetical intentionalism or the value maximizing theory, provided our object of interpretation is the word as author. Philosophers of art sometimes speak of meaning being recovered or imposed. To recover something is to expose what is already present. To impose is or create something and ascribe it to another thing. Identity-relevant properties cannot be imposed, since they are identity conditions that must exist before one can ascribe properties to the thing they identify. This means that if our aim of interpretation is to recover the meaning of a title rather than impose a meaning on it, we will need to exclude any interpretative theory that involves imposition of meaning. Anti-intentionalism and actual intentionalism are easily classified as belonging to the recovery camp. The anti-intentionalist claims to recover word meaning through conventions, while the actual intentionalist claims to recover word meaning through conventions. While the actual intentionalist claims to do so by grasping the content of the author's intention. By contrast, hypothetical intentionalism and the value maximizing theory could well fall under the impositionalist heading, hence excluded from candidates for interpreting titles. Regarding the value maximizing theory, it has been pointed out by Peter Lamarck that it is a creative view of interpretation, since this theory seeks to create interpretations that maximize aesthetic interest in a work. This characterization is echoed by Noel Carroll, who thinks the maximizing view as a variation on the reader response theory, with the special focus on establishing the meaning of a word in pursuit of aesthetic experience. Holding a maximizing view about titles is to impose a meaning on a title that guides the interpreter to arrive at an interpretation or interpretations more aesthetically rewarding than otherwise obtained. Though this is controversial, some philosophers also think of hypothetical intentionalism as some sort of impositionalism, because in this theory, what the audience does in the end is construct a hypothesis as truth rather than recovering truth proper. In this sense, a hypothetical intentionalist about titles would be imposing a meaning on the title instead of recovering its meaning through the best hypothesis about the author's intention. This consequence becomes more obvious given that the hypothetical intentionalist allows that more than one hypothesis can be equally best. My conclusion so far is that if we want to interpret a work with a contextualist basis, that is, if our object of interpretation is the word as author, we should interpret titles with the retrieval views of interpretation, such as anti-intentionalism or actual intentionalism. However, if our aim of interpreting titles is different, the story will be different too. This paper is still in an incredibly crude form, so all sorts of feedback are welcome. There are still many details to be developed. Also, this is only a draft.
All right.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks. So applause. And I will, so keep on asking your questions with question in front of it over in the text, and I will hand it over to Aaron. Szu-Yen, could you, thank you, perfect, never mind.
Thank you very much.
All right. So Cynthia asks, is the account meant to apply as well to paintings and musical works in addition to works of literature? And what are you going to say about the title Untitled for paintings? So does the account apply to non-literary cases?
Yeah, of course, because for example, in the paper by Levinson, he talks about his main example are all from visual art. And I think many questions about interpretation, they are all very similar in different categories of art. So I do think the material I presented here can be applied to different art forms. So I don't see a problem.
So then there are some questions about these particular sort of non-titled titles, like the title Untitled, and then Saul Fisher asks about poems that are numbered as a way, as a deflection from titling.
Yeah, I think there are two different cases of untitled. The first case is that there's no title at all there. You know, even the word untitled. Yeah, because sometimes the author will give a title named untitled. Yeah, but the first case I'm talking about is that there is not even a title there. And in that case, I don't think the debate about titles will apply here. So we just don't have a contextual factor that is title. Yeah. And the second case is that the author indeed gives a title called untitled. Yeah. And if that is the case, there is nothing there to be interpreted. In the first case, there is nothing at all. So in the second case, there's something to be interpreted. And if there is something to be interpreted, then there is a debate about interpretation and the level of titles. So we can either, I mean, in my presentation, I just mentioned we can either use convention or actual intentionalism to interpret this untitled. Of course, if from the viewpoint of conventionalism, you may say that there is only one meaning in this case, namely untitled, there's no title. But maybe we can think of some cases from the viewpoint of actual intentionalism. Maybe the author's intention is ironic. For example, a poet writes a poem and he wants to say something ironic about works not having any title at all. So he gives the title untitled. So I mean, there are different possibilities. The title untitled can be multiply interpreted. So if the author's intention is not one as the conventionalist will take it, then there is room for interpretation. And as long as the author's intention succeeds, then we can have a different interpretation. I mean, this is what I want to say is that even if the author gives the title untitled, there is still room for interpretation. And in the case of actual intentionalism, they can still have different interpretation and see whether the author's intention is compatible with the title untitled. Sorry, what is the second question?
So the question from Saul was just about poems that were numbered, but I take it your account, so numbered instead of titled.
The collection of titling. Oh, hi, Saul. Yeah, it's been a while. I'm not sure I understand a deflection.
Okay.
Yeah.
Saul, maybe put a little explanation in the comments, and I'm going to move on. So Justine asks whether hypothetical intentionalism might be an attempt to retrieve meaning in the light of lack of information about actual intentions rather than to impose meaning.
Yeah. As I say in my presentation, I'm not so sure about hypothetical intentionalism. So I might need more time to think about this. But what I want to say is that, yeah, some people might think that hypothetical intentionalism can still be taken as a position to recover meaning, because ultimately their end is still the actual author's intention. So through hypothesis, it is like tracking down the actual author's intention. So in this sense, it is still some form of recovering meaning. But maybe if we want to take hypothetical intentionalism as an impositional view of meaning, it will make more sense to consider another version of hypothetical intentionalism, which I didn't mention in my presentation. There's a second variation on hypothetical intentionalism that focuses on the so-called hypothetical author. And this position is more like the impositional view because it claims that the meaning of a work is not determined in the metaphysical or constitutive sense, but it's more like a meaning constructed by the reader from the text through an imagined or hypothetical author. So I mean, if it's Levinson's version, I'm not so sure. So I may need more time to think about this. Thank you.
Okay, so a couple questions about the relationship between the interpretation of the title and the interpretation about the rest of the work. So Jonathan asks, is it consistent to be an actual intentionalist with regard to titles and a hypothetical intentionalist with regard to works?
Yeah, I think these are different questions. So in the problem of interpretation, there are many different levels. For example, I mentioned the very basic level is to establish the text. And at this level, I mean, no matter at which level, we can always have these positions to choose from. And so establishing the text, you can be an actual intentionalist. And at the level of title, you can be another position. But of course, that depends on your very aim of interpretation. If you want to preserve the word as author, so as I say, I will think that at the level of interpreting titles, conventionalism or anti-intentionalism. Okay, conventionalism is another label for anti-intentionalism. I will think that anti-intentionalism or actual intentionalism will be a position more plausible than others. And if we come closer to the third level, that is interpreting works, so the meaning of the work, then again, we have different positions to choose from. And what I want to say here is that if our object of interpretation is the word as author, namely if we have contextualist leanings, then we, at the level of titles, it may be better for us to adopt anti-intentionalism or actual intentionalism to identify the right title and then proceed to other positions of interpretation like hypothetical intentionalism or value maximizing theory. And again, depending upon our aim of interpretation. Yeah.
I think we have to stop there.
I think we do too. So thanks so much. And thanks to everybody for coming. And so let's applaud this last. So thanks, and thanks for all of the questions. And thanks everybody for coming and for asking good questions and for excellent presentations.